Young schoolteacher defied the sheriff until he claimed her as his lost sister. Catherine Reed thought she was just a schoolteacher fighting a corrupt sheriff. But when he stared into her green eyes with recognition and whispered Emma, she realized her entire life had been built on a lie. The dust never settled in Millbrook. It hung in the air like guilt, coating everything with the color of dried blood and broken promises. Catherine Reed stepped off the stagecoach into that choking haze, her carpet bag clutched tight against her chest, and felt the weight of 100 eyes measuring her worth. She was small, the townspeople would say later. Too small to stand against Sheriff Jake Morrison. Too young to understand how things worked in a place where water was scarce and mercy was scarcer. But they didn't see what Catherine saw in the faces of the children who watched her from doorways and windows. Hunger that had nothing to do with empty bellies and everything to do with empty minds. The boarding house was a crooked building that leaned against the general store like a drunk against a bar. Mrs. Henley, the proprietor, looked Catherine up and down with the calculating gaze of a woman who'd learned to size up trouble before it arrived. "You the new teacher, Mrs.?" Henley asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't matter long. "I am. Catherine Reed." Catherine set her bag down and extended her hand, noting how the older woman's fingers were stained with lye soap and resignation. "Well, Miss Reed, I hope you brought more than books in that bag. You're going to need more than the alphabet to survive Jake Morrison." Catherine had heard whispers about the sheriff during her journey, fragments of stories told in hushed voices when decent folks thought children weren't listening. How he collected taxes that went into his own pocket. How businesses that didn't pay found their windows broken or their stock mysteriously spoiled. How the town had learned to look away when Jake Morrison decided someone needed teaching. But Catherine had also heard about the children. 15 of them between the ages of 6 and 14, bright as new pennies and just as unused. The territorial government had promised a school, but promises were like tumbleweeds in this country. They blew away with the first strong wind. "Where might I find a suitable place for classes?" Catherine asked, ignoring the warning in Mrs. Henley's voice. "The old church at the end of Main Street. Been empty since Reverend Michaels took sick and died. Roof leaks, but it's got walls and windows." "Mrs." Henley paused, studying Catherine's face. "Sheriff won't like it, you teaching there. Says book learning makes children soft. Makes them think they're better than their station." Catherine's green eyes hardened like bottle glass in a fire. "Then the sheriff and I will have to disagree." The church was worse than Mrs. Henley had described. Dust lay thick as carpet on the floor, and sparrows had built nests in the rafters. But the windows faced east, perfect for morning light, and the space was large enough for proper lessons. Catherine rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By afternoon, she had swept the floors and scrubbed the windows until they sparkled. She arranged wooden crates into desks and chairs, hung her few books on nails driven into the wall, and wrote the alphabet across the front boards in careful, flowing letters. The chalk dust mixed with the desert dust, creating something new, something that smelled like possibility. The children came at sunset, drawn by curiosity and the strange sight of someone who believed in tomorrow. They stood in the doorway like wild creatures, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Catherine sat on a crate in the center of the room and opened her oldest, most treasured book, a collection of fairy tales her adoptive mother had given her years ago. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice soft as candlelight, "in a kingdom far, far away." The children crept closer, hypnotized by words that painted pictures in their minds. Little Maria Gonzalez, whose father worked the mine. Tommy Patterson, whose mother took in washing. Sarah Chun, whose family ran the laundry and spoke in whispers about the home they'd left behind. They were all there, faces bright with wonder, when Sheriff Jake Morrison filled the doorway. He was everything the stories had promised, tall as a pine tree, broad as a barn door, with eyes the color of winter storms. His badge caught the lamplight, and his hand rested easy on the gun at his hip. The children scattered like startled birds, leaving Catherine alone with the man who ruled Millbrook through fear. "Miss Reed." His voice was gravel and smoke, surprisingly cultured for a man who lived by violence. Sheriff Morrison. Catherine stood slowly, keeping her hands visible and her voice steady. She'd learned long ago that fear was a choice, and she chose differently. Heard you were setting up school. The children deserve an education. Jake stepped into the room, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. He picked up one of Catherine's books, turning it over in hands that were scarred from fights and work. Pretty thing like you shouldn't be filling children's heads with nonsense. Makes them restless. Makes them forget their place. Their place is wherever their minds can take them. Jake's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Their place is working the mind, tending the store, keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. That's how decent folk survive in this country. Catherine moved closer, close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair. Close enough to notice something else, a sadness so deep it seemed to have roots. And what about indecent folks, Sheriff? What do they do to survive? The question hung between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake's hand tightened on the book, and for a moment Catherine thought he might strike her. Instead, he set it down with careful precision. They adapt, Miss Reed. They do what needs doing and don't ask questions about right and wrong. His eyes met hers, and Catherine felt something stir in her memory, a flash of recognition so brief she almost missed it. Close the school. No. The word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence in every direction. Jake's face darkened, but Catherine held her ground. This is my town, Miss Reed. My rules. This is American territory, Sheriff Morrison. The children have a right to learn. Rights are what I say they are. Catherine stepped closer still, so close she could smell leather and gunpowder and something else, something familiar that tugged at memories she couldn't quite grasp. Then you and I have very different ideas about justice. Jake stared at her for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes searching her face as if looking for something lost. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost puzzled. You remind me of someone. Doi. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, though she couldn't say why. Someone who used to believe in fairy tales and happy endings. Jake touched his hat brim, a gesture that seemed automatic, learned long ago and never forgotten. Keep the school closed, Miss Reed. For your own good. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the gathering darkness. Catherine stood alone in the makeshift classroom, surrounded by books and dreams and the lingering scent of something that felt like home. Outside, night fell across Millbrook like a curtain, hiding the stars behind clouds of dust and regret. But in the old church, lamplight pushed back the shadows, and Catherine Reed opened her book once more, reading to an empty room as if all the children in the world were listening. She didn't know yet that Sheriff Jake Morrison stood in the street outside, watching the light spill from her windows and wondering why her voice sounded like an echo from his past, like a song he'd forgotten he knew, sung by someone he'd lost so long ago he'd stopped believing she ever existed. Every night, Catherine dreamed of a boy with storm-gray eyes calling her name, but she'd never seen him before, or had she? 20 years of buried memories were about to surface in the most impossible way. The school grew like wildflowers after rain, stubborn, beautiful, and impossible to stop. Despite Sheriff Morrison's warnings, or perhaps because of them, the children came. They arrived at dawn with lunch pails made from old tobacco tins, their faces scrubbed clean and bright with anticipation. Catherine's heart swelled each morning as she watched them file through the doorway of the old church, transforming the abandoned sanctuary into something sacred again. Little Maria was the first to read a complete sentence, her voice trembling with pride as she sounded out the words. Tommy Patterson discovered he had a gift for numbers, working sums in the dirt with a stick when Catherine ran out of slates. Sarah Chun translated lessons for the younger Mexican children, her quick mind switching between languages like a bird between branches. But it was during the quiet moments that Catherine noticed him, Sheriff Morrison, watching from the shadows across the street. He never came close enough to interfere, never made good on his threats to close the school. He just stood there in the morning light, his face unreadable, his storm-gray eyes fixed on something that seemed to pain him. Catherine found herself studying him in return, drawn by a mystery she couldn't name. There was something in the way he held himself, a careful stillness that spoke of old wounds. Sometimes she caught him rubbing his left shoulder, as if remembering an injury that had never quite healed. Once, she saw him smile at something one of the children said, and the expression transformed his face completely, made him look younger, gentler, like the man he might have been in another life. The dream started in the 3rd week. Catherine would wake in her narrow bed at Mrs. Henley's boarding house, her heart racing from visions that felt more like memories than imagination. A boy with dark hair and storm-colored eyes, calling her name. Not Catherine, another name, something that started with E and tasted like sunshine and safety. The boy would be reaching for her across a vast distance, his voice growing fainter even as she tried to run toward him. "Emma," he would call. "Emma, come back." But Catherine had never been called Emma, had never known anyone by that name. The dreams left her restless and hollow, as if she were mourning someone she'd never met. The 4th week brought crisis in the form of little Miguel Santos, burning with fever and crying for his mother in Spanish. The other children huddled in corners, frightened by the sound of his suffering. Catherine knelt beside the boy, feeling the heat radiating from his small body, and something inside her knew exactly what to do. She sent Tommy to fetch willow bark from the creek, dispatched Sarah for cool water, and began mixing a poultice with herbs she somehow knew would break the fever. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, grinding remedies and murmuring comfort in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. The children watched in amazement as Catherine worked, her movements sure and swift. She bathed Miguel's forehead with cool cloths, spooned bitter medicine between his lips, and sang a lullaby in a language she didn't remember learning. By evening, the boy's fever had broken, and he slept peacefully in his mother's arms. Word of the healing spread through Millbrook like smoke on the wind. Mrs. Henley brought Catherine tea and a knowing look. "Learned that from the nuns at the mission school, did you?" Catherine stirred her tea slowly, trying to understand how she'd known what to do. "I suppose I must have." But the truth felt more complicated than that, buried under years of careful forgetting. Sometimes, when she was mixing herbs or humming to soothe a crying child, Catherine felt like she was wearing someone else's skin, someone who had learned these skills long before any mission school, in a place where survival depended on reading the signs in bark and leaves and sky. Sheriff Morrison came that night. Catherine was cleaning the schoolhouse by lamplight, erasing the day's lessons from the boards, when his shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up to find him standing there, hat in hand, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "Heard about the Santos boy," he said quietly. "He's recovering well." Jake stepped into the room, and Catherine noticed how his eyes traveled over the children's work displayed on the walls. Drawings and letters and simple arithmetic that spoke of minds opening like flowers to the sun. "Where did you learn to do that?" "The healing." Catherine set down her cloth and chalk, studying his face in the lamplight. "I'm not sure. It just came to me, like you'd done it before." "Yes." The admission surprised her with its honesty. "Like I'd done it many times before." Jake moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. There was something hungry in his expression, as if he were searching for answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Tell me about before," he said. "Before you came here. Before the mission school." Catherine's hands stilled on the desk. The question stirred something deep in her chest, a longing so sharp it took her breath away. "There isn't much to tell. I was orphaned young, raised by good people who gave me an education and a chance at a better life." "What happened to your parents?" The words came from somewhere dark and painful, pulled up from depths she'd spent years learning to avoid. "Apache raid, near the border. I was the only survivor." Jake's face went white as chalk dust. He gripped the edge of a desk, so hard his knuckles stood out like bone, and Catherine saw his hands tremble. "How old were you?" 7, maybe 8. It's hard to remember exactly. Catherine watched his face with growing concern. "Sheriff, are you all right?" He didn't answer, just stared at her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to be seeing something else entirely. His breathing had gone shallow, and a muscle jumped in his jaw like he was fighting some internal battle. "The scar," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "On your wrist. How did you get it?" Catherine looked down at her left wrist, where a thin white line marked her skin like a thread of memory. She'd carried that scar so long she barely noticed it anymore, a reminder of childhood clumsiness and the kindness of strangers. "I fell from a tree when I was small. Someone carried me home and bandaged it up." She touched the mark absently. "I can barely remember his face, but I remember his voice. He sang to me while I cried." Jake made a sound like a wounded animal. He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with some terrible knowledge, and Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet like sand in a windstorm. "Sheriff? What is it?" When he looked at her again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that looked like desperate hope. "That song," he whispered. "What did it sound like?" Catherine's throat tightened. She hadn't thought about that melody in years, but somehow her mouth remembered the shape of it. Her voice recalled the gentle rhythm that had once soothed a frightened child's tears. "Hush now, baby, don't you cry," she sang softly, the words rising from some buried place in her heart. "Papa's going to buy you a mockingbird." Jake's face crumpled. He sank into one of the small chairs, his large frame folded over like a man in prayer, and Catherine heard him whisper a single word that stopped her heart. "Emma." The name hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her memory she'd thought were lost forever. Images flashed behind her eyes. A boy with storm-colored eyes teaching her to braid grass, showing her which berries were safe to eat, carrying her on his back across streams that ran clear and cold. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the old church like the sound of the past trying to get in. When Jake Morrison saw the scar on Catherine's wrist, the same scar he'd bandaged 20 years ago, he realized the little sister he'd mourned as dead had been alive all along, and he'd become everything she would have hated. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with 20 years of grief and impossible hope. Catherine's hand flew to her throat, her green eyes wide with something that looked like terror and recognition fighting for space in her heart. "Emma," Jake whispered again, and this time it wasn't a question. Catherine backed away from him, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "My name is Catherine. Catherine Reed. I don't know why you keep saying, because that's who you are." Jake stood slowly, his movements careful, as if he were approaching a wild creature that might bolt. "You're Emma Morrison. My little sister." The words hit Catherine like stones, each one cracking something fragile inside her chest. She shook her head violently, chalk dust rising from her hair like snow. "That's impossible. My family died in the raid. I was alone, found by travelers, taken to the Apache first." Jake's voice was steady now, certain as sunrise. "Then traded to a Mexican family who loved you enough to give you their name and their protection. But before all that, you were my sister. My responsibility. The one I failed to protect." Catherine's breathing came in sharp bursts. Images were cascading through her mind now. Fragments of memory she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself they were dreams. A boy with storm-gray eyes teaching her to whistle. Strong arms lifting her onto a horse's back. A voice singing her to sleep when thunder made her cry. "The tree," she whispered, touching the scar on her wrist. "I fell from the cottonwood by the creek. You were trying to reach a bird's nest. I told you not to climb so high, but you never listened." Jake's voice broke on the words. "You cut your wrist on a sharp branch on the way down. I carried you home, and Mama cleaned the wound while I held your hand and sang that song." Catherine's knees gave way. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling with the weight of recovered memory. She could see it now, their mother's gentle hands, their father's worried face, the safety of a family that had loved her completely. "The raid," she said, her voice barely audible. Jake's face hardened into the mask she'd seen him wear in town, the sheriff who ruled through fear and violence. But now she could see the broken boy underneath, the one who'd carried guilt like stones in his chest for 20 years. I was 15, thought I was old enough to handle anything. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Papa sent me to check the north pasture for strays. Said to take you with me because you'd been cooped up in the house with a fever and needed fresh air. Catherine closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 7 years old again, riding behind her big brother on his chestnut mare, her arms wrapped around his waist as they rode through morning that smelled like sage and possibility. But you didn't take me, she said quietly. I was angry about something stupid. Can't even remember what now. Told Papa I could handle it myself, that I didn't need a baby sister slowing me down. Jake's voice was raw with self-hatred. Left you at the house with Mama and Papa, promising I'd bring you something special from town if you were good. The memory of that promise hit Catherine like a physical blow. She could see herself standing in the doorway, disappointed but trying to be brave, waving goodbye to the brother who meant everything to her. The Apache came while I was gone. Jake continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before they poisoned him completely. By the time I got back, the house was burning. I found Mama and Papa, but I never found you. Searched for days, weeks. The trail was cold, and everyone said you were dead. That you'd been taken for sport and killed when they were done with you. Catherine's heart shattered for the boy he'd been. 15 years old and drowning in guilt, believing he'd failed in the most fundamental way a brother could fail. But I wasn't dead, she said softly. No, you were alive, and I was too much of a coward to keep looking. Too broken by what I'd seen. Too convinced that I'd lost everyone who mattered. Jake ran his hands through his hair, and Catherine saw the gray threads there, the lines of worry and regret that had carved themselves into his face. I blamed myself for leaving you behind. Blamed God for taking my family. Blamed the world for being cruel enough to let a boy's selfishness destroy everything good. Jake. The name felt strange on her tongue, but right too. Like coming home to a language she'd forgotten she spoke. What happened to you after? His laugh was bitter as alkali water. What happens to any boy who loses everything? I got hard. Got mean. Learned to take what I wanted instead of waiting for life to give me scraps. He gestured around the schoolhouse, at the evidence of her gentle influence. I became everything you would have hated. Catherine stood slowly, her mind still reeling, but her heart beginning to understand. She looked at this man who'd been her brother, really looked at him for the first time. Under the sheriff's badge and the gunfighter's swagger, she could see traces of the boy who'd carried her on his shoulders, who'd taught her to skip stones and catch fireflies. You became what you thought you needed to become to survive. I became a bully, a thief in a badge. Jake's voice was full of disgust. I take money from people who can't afford to lose it. I threaten children and intimidate decent folks who just want to live their lives in peace. I'm everything our parents raised us not to be. Catherine moved closer to him, seeing the pain that had shaped him into something sharp and dangerous. And I became a teacher, someone who protects children and fights for what's right. She reached out tentatively, touching his arm. Maybe we both became what we needed to become to find each other again. Jake looked down at her small hand on his sleeve, and Catherine saw tears gathering in his storm-gray eyes. You don't understand. The things I've done, I understand that you're my brother. The words came out stronger than she felt, but they rang with truth. I understand that you've been in pain for 20 years, carrying guilt that was never yours to carry. I left you behind, Emma. I chose my own pride over your safety. You were a 15-year-old boy who made a 15-year-old boy's decision. The Apache chose to raid our ranch. They chose violence. You didn't choose any of that. Jake shook his head, but Catherine saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The people in this town, she said quietly, the children I teach, they see the sheriff who intimidates and takes what he wants. But I see the brother who taught me to be brave, who sang to me when I was scared, who would have died to protect me if he'd been there. I wasn't there, but you're here now. Catherine's voice was steady, certain, and so am I. After 20 years of being lost, we found each other. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 2 decades of separation and the impossible weight of recognition. Outside, night had settled over Millbrook like a blanket, but inside the old church, lamplight pushed back the darkness and made everything feel possible again. Jake looked around the schoolhouse, at the children's drawings on the walls, the books arranged with loving care, the alphabet written in Catherine's careful hand across the front board. This was what his sister had built while he'd been taking and breaking and ruling through fear. "They love you," he said quietly. "The children, the townspeople. They love you the way they used to love the idea of me, before I forgot who I was supposed to be." Catherine's heart broke for all the years they'd lost, all the choices that had led them down such different paths. "It's not too late, Jake. It's never too late to remember." When he looked at her again, she saw not the corrupt sheriff but the big brother she'd adored, the one who'd promised to bring her something special, who'd carried 20 years of guilt for a promise he'd never had the chance to keep. "I don't know how to be good anymore, Emma. I've been bad for so long." Catherine smiled through her tears, and for a moment she was 7 years old again, looking up at the brother who'd been her whole world. "Then I'll teach you. That's what teachers do. We help people remember who they were always meant to be." Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, of new possibilities blooming in ground that had seemed too hard and dry to nurture anything beautiful. When the town discovered their corrupt sheriff was the schoolteacher's brother, they demanded Catherine choose: leave with her blood family, or lose the children she'd sworn to protect forever. Dawn came to Millbrook like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself wasn't sure what it would find in the light. Catherine sat on the steps of the old church, watching Jake pace the dusty street like a caged wolf. They'd talked through the night, 20 years of stories compressed into hours, filling the spaces between who they'd been and who they'd become. The revelation hadn't healed them. If anything, it had opened wounds they'd both learned to ignore, exposing the raw places where love and loss had carved them into strangers. "The town's going to wake up soon," Jake said, his voice rough from talking and remembering. "Word will spread about who you are, who we are." Catherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the morning chill settle into her bones. "Does it matter what they think?" Jake's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "Everything I've done to these people, Emma, everything I've taken from them. When they find out you're my sister. My name is Catherine now." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she needed him to understand. Emma was a little girl who died in that raid, just like the boy who used to sing lullabies and catch fireflies. "We're different people now, are we?" Jake stopped pacing and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that held too much pain. "Because I feel exactly like that 15-year-old boy who failed to protect his sister. And you." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. "You're still trying to save everyone, just like you did when we were children." Before Catherine could answer, footsteps echoed down Main Street. "Mrs. Henley approached with her usual purposeful stride, but her face carried news that made Catherine's stomach clench. "Miss Reed." Mrs. Henley's voice was careful, controlled. "Sheriff. Heard you two had quite a long talk last night." Catherine's heart sank. In a town as small as Millbrook, secrets had the lifespan of morning frost. "Mrs. Henley, is it true?" The older woman's eyes moved between them, searching for answers in their faces. "Are you really his sister? The one who was supposed to be dead?" The silence stretched between them like a hell breath. Catherine felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Deny it and live as a lie, or admit it and watch her carefully built world crumble. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm Emma Morrison, his sister." Mrs. Henley's face went through a dozen emotions: shock, understanding, something that looked like sympathy warring with disappointment. Lord have mercy. By noon, the entire town knew. Catherine watched from the schoolhouse windows as clusters of people gathered in the street, their voices carrying fragments of judgment and fear. Some spoke of blood being thicker than water, of family obligations that couldn't be ignored. Others whispered about corruption and guilt by association, about whether the sheriff's sister could really be trusted with their children. The children came anyway. They slipped in through the back door like shadows, their faces worried but determined. Little Maria carried wildflowers. Tommy brought his slate, carefully cleaned. Sarah led the younger ones by the hand, her chin set with stubborn loyalty. "Are you leaving us, Miss Catherine?" Maria's voice was small, frightened. Catherine knelt to the child's level, taking the offered flowers with hands that trembled slightly. "I don't want to leave you. But people are saying you have to," Tommy said. "Saying you belong with the sheriff now, 'cause he's your family." "People say lots of things," Catherine replied, though her heart was breaking. "What do you think? Do you think I belong with you or with him?" "Both," Sarah said with the wisdom of someone who'd learned early that the world was more complicated than grown-ups like to pretend. "Can't you belong to both?" The simple question cut straight to the heart of Catherine's dilemma. She'd spent years building a life as Catherine Reed, teacher and protector of children. But Emma Morrison had been Jake's sister first, bound to him by blood and shared loss and the terrible weight of their parents' memory. "Sometimes belonging means choosing," Catherine said softly. The confrontation came that evening, as Catherine was cleaning the boards after another day of lessons conducted under the shadow of uncertain futures. The church doors burst open, and Tom Bradley, who owned the largest mine in the territory, strode in with half a dozen other prominent townsmen behind him. "Miss Reed," Bradley's voice echoed in the empty space. "Or should I say, Miss Morrison?" Catherine set down her cloth and turned to face them, her spine straight and her chin raised. "Catherine Reed is the name I've earned. It's the name I choose." "Choice." Bradley spat the word like something sour. "You think you get to choose after what we've learned? After what your brother has put this town through?" "I'm not responsible for my brother's actions." "Aren't you?" Another man, Peterson, who ran the general store, stepped forward. "Blood is blood, miss. Family is family. How do we know you haven't been working with him all along? Reporting back about our children, our businesses?" Catherine felt anger rise in her chest like flood water. "Because you know me. You've seen what I've built here, how much I care about these children." "We thought we knew you," Bradley interrupted. "But that was before we learned you've been lying about who you are from the very beginning." The accusation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She thought of all the trust she'd built, all the small victories and gentle moments that had made Millbrook feel like home. All of it crumbling because of blood she hadn't chosen and a past she'd survived rather than lived. "You want me to leave?" It wasn't a question. "We want you to make the right choice," Peterson said. "Go with your brother. Start fresh somewhere else. Let our children learn from someone we can trust." Catherine looked around the schoolhouse, at the alphabet still written across the board, at the children's drawings on the walls, at the books she'd arranged with such hope and care. This place had been her sanctuary, her purpose, her proof that love could triumph over loss. "And if I refuse?" Bradley's face hardened. "Then we'll close the school ourselves. No funding, no supplies, no children allowed to attend. You could teach all you want to empty rooms." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine realized they had her trapped. Leave voluntarily or watch everything she'd built die slowly. That's when Jake filled the doorway. He moved into the room with that quiet authority Catherine remembered from childhood, but something had changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by something steadier, more real. The men turned to face him, and Catherine saw fear flicker across their faces. "Gentlemen," Jake said quietly, "seems like you're having a meeting in my sister's schoolhouse without inviting me." "Sheriff Morrison." Bradley's voice was carefully neutral. "We were just discussing. I heard what you were discussing." Jake's eyes moved around the room, taking in each man's face. "Interesting how brave you all get when it's one woman against 6 men." "This isn't about bravery," Peterson said. "It's about trust. About knowing who we could depend on." Jake nodded slowly. "Trust. That's interesting coming from men who've been paying me protection money for 3 years without ever once standing up and saying it was wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine watched the men's faces change as Jake's words hit home. The shame, the recognition, the uncomfortable truth that they'd all been complicit in the very corruption they now condemned. "You want to talk about trust?" Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. My sister has given you more in 3 months than I've given you in 3 years. She's taught your children to read, healed their sickness, shown them that the world can be bigger than the narrow boundaries of fear you've built around this town. But she's your sister, Bradley said weakly. Yes, she is. She's my sister, and I'm proud of that fact. Jake moved to stand beside Catherine, and she felt the warmth of his presence like sunlight after storm. She's also the best person I've ever known, and if you run her out of town because of her connection to me, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your lives. Catherine looked up at her brother, really looked at him, and saw something she thought was lost forever. The boy who'd taught her to be brave was still there, just older and scarred by 20 years of wrong choices. But he was standing up now, choosing to protect rather than intimidate. What are you saying, Sheriff? Bradley asked. Jake reached up and unpinned the badge from his vest. The metal caught the lamplight as he set it on Catherine's desk, the sound of it hitting would echoing in the silent room. I'm saying that Catherine Reed is the best teacher these children will ever have. She's earned her place here through love and service and sacrifice. Jake's voice was steady, certain. If you want her gone, you'll have to explain to your children why you chose fear over the woman who taught them that words have power, that knowledge is freedom, that even the smallest person can make the world better. The men looked at each other, then at the badge lying on the desk, then at Catherine standing straight and proud beside her brother. The weight of the choice settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Keep the school open, Bradley said finally. But understand, we'll be watching. They filed out one by one, their footsteps echoing in the gathering darkness. Catherine and Jake stood alone in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of everything she'd built and everything he'd chosen to give up. You didn't have to do that, Catherine said softly. Yes, I did. Jake picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands. I've spent 20 years being the wrong kind of man. Maybe it's time I learned to be the right kind of brother. Catherine smiled through her tears. What will you do now? I was thinking maybe this town could use a different kind of sheriff. Someone who protects instead of takes. Someone who serves instead of rules. Jake looked around the schoolhouse. But first, I was hoping my sister might teach me how to read better. I never did finish my schooling. I'd be honored to teach you. Outside, the stars appeared one by one in the vast desert sky, cold and distant as the mistakes they'd both made. But inside the old church, lamplight pushed back the shadows, and 2 people who'd been lost for 20 years finally found their way home. Not to the children they'd been, but to the adults they'd chosen to become. Catherine opened her oldest book and began to read aloud, her voice mixing with Jake's deeper tones as he struggled through the words. The sound of their shared learning filled the empty spaces between past and future, between blood and choice, between the weight of what they'd lost and the promise of what they still might build together.